Welcome to Sensation and Perception Week 2, which happens to fall on week 9 of this semester. We are moving right along. So let's start. Last week we talked about sensation, how our eyes, nose, ears, mouth take in all of this different information from our environment. Now we're looking at the flip side of that, how our bodies, minds process that information and now use it to inform us what's going on and how we perceive different information. So, very interesting stuff. So, let's get started. So, what is the relationship? Perception brings meaning to sensation. Well, last week we talked about we receive neural impulses, receive, transduction, receive. Well, now we're going to give all of that information some meaning. Okay, so perception produces an interpretation of the external world, not a perfect representation of it. What that means is how we could both watch the same thing, and I and you are going to see two different things or perceive it just a little bit differently. Okay, so let's talk about how we perceive things. Percept is a meaningful product of perception. Okay, so how you perceive, your percept, is how your perception of certain events has occurred. So the machinery of perception are feature detectors. They are cells in the cortex that specialize in extracting certain features of the stimulus. Now this is really one of the only biological aspects we will be focusing on. Feature detectors are tied very tightly into the biology aspect of it. They're cell in each of the cortexes which process information from all the senses. These are called feature detectors. A binding problem is a major unsolved mystery in cognitive psychology. The reason why it's so unknown is because the physical process of the brain to combine many aspects of sensation into a single perception is what we don't understand. We do not know how we perceive things in absolutes. We have theories, we have ideas, we know parts of the story, we just don't know the whole thing. And that's why the binding problem is our brains are so much further advanced than we can imagine that we can hear, smell, see, and touch something, and we have all this information that form one idea or one experience. We don't know how the brain does it, though. We're not 100% sure. But we do have some theories, and that's what we're going to talk about this week. So, how we start making sense of the world is bottom-up and top-down processing. Now, bottom-up processing analysis that emphasizes characteristic of the stimulus rather than the internal concepts. An example of this is if we are trying to figure out how to make chocolate chip cookies, we would take a chocolate chip cookie, break it apart, and try to figure out what the pieces are. We take the whole, we break it down to its smaller parts, breaking it up, crumbling it up, and then we'll try to figure out how to make one. Bottom-up processing. Start at the basis, build your way up. Top-down processing emphasizes the perceiver's expectations, memories, and other cognitive factors. When we're dealing with top-down processing, we're trying to think through information from the highest level down. So when we try to solve problems like world peace and world hunger, we start at the big problems. Well, Africa is known for lack of peace times due to the conflicts of the tribes that live there. How can we solve this problem? Well, going down from there. Looking at that same problem of finding peace in Africa, the bottom-up processing is, well, this tribe and this tribe don't get along. If we could get them to get along, and we could get them to get along, and we could get another tribe to get along, slowly and surely, eventually, we'll get the whole content of Africa working together. Bottom-up is looking at the small parts going up. Top-down is we're looking at the big problem and breaking it down into smaller groups. Okay, So perceptual consistency is the ability to recognize the same object under different conditions such as changes, illumination, distance, or location. Now, think about it. When you see a friend who has gone through a total makeover, totally different, looks different, the way they dress, the way they're styling their hair, all of that, you recognize your friends. However, they are under completely different conditions. Okay? That's what this is about. In order to understand something, there has to be a perceptual consistency. However, doesn't always mean that it's going to work out all the time. Now, perceptual ambiguity and distortion are really what we like to manipulate. When we can understand and recognize things over and over again, we have perceptual consistency. When we're dealing with ambiguity or not knowing what's occurring, we're dealing with illusions. So when things go wrong and we're not seeing what we think we're seeing, we're dealing with an illusion. When we see something that's changed just a little bit, but we can still recognize it and we understand what's going on, that's perceptual consistency. So what's an illusion? We hear about them all the time. Magicians doing illusions, Chris Angel and his illusions. So what are they? They're demonstrating incorrect experience of a stimulus pattern shared by others in the same perceptual environment. Simplified, they are tricking you into seeing something to not see something else. Okay? Just like a magician, what they try to do is they try to distract you and have you look at one thing while they do another. Okay? That's an illusion. Ambiguous figures are images that are capable of more than one interpretation. So when you see a lot of different things going on, okay, and you can't put your finger on it, that's an ambiguous figures, okay? If I showed you, and I will show you a video clip, we're going to talk about what's going on and what's our different perceptions. So the perceptual illusions is where we're really going to be spending a lot of time. Okay, so here's the first one we'll be looking at. Do you see? That's not a great one. Hold on. Now, in this perceptual illusion, if you look at these boxes, what do you notice that's happening? Now, if you're thinking you are starting to see gray dots in the corners, you're not wrong. Okay, the small gray squares are fitting in between the black squares. Now the reason why this is happening is because our eyes are processing so much information that they're trying to fill in the gaps. This is a perceptual illusion. Okay? So what are some of the theoretical explanations for perception? There's learning-based inferences. So the more educated you are, the more likely you are to see holes in illusions. Okay? Also, that our experiences allow us to be shaped by the learning rather than innate factors. So, illusions work, or perception is primarily shaped by learning rather than innate factors. So, our environment shapes our ability for learning base. A perceptual set is the readiness to detect a particular stimulus in a given context. So if I'm showing you, like I will be today, a bunch of different illusions, you're going to be expecting there's a trick. Now, if we were just in the class and I was just put up some pictures and we talked about it, I showed you pictures of my vacation, showed you pictures of my cats, and did all this and threw in a couple illusions, you would be more likely not to notice the illusion because you're not expecting it. If I continued to show you illusions and tricked you and made you really focus on them, you're more likely to detect. That's perceptual set. In psychology, you're thinking you're probably going to be tricked. In math class, you're probably not thinking your teacher's trying to trick you. Okay? So, cultural influences on perception. Okay? Looking at this box, which one's bigger? Okay? Which one is it? In fact, they're both the same. Okay? So, what does that have to do with cultural factors? Well, cultural differences on perception is pretty significant. Every culture has its own view on the world. Here in America, we see ourselves as very dominant, have to be the center of attention, very forceful, both men and women. However, in Middle Eastern countries are believe that culture is very heavily influenced by personal sense. Okay, so the way you smell affects how you can communicate. In Asian cultures, talk is perceived very differently. Silence is valued. Okay, so how does Western culture compare? We're much more upfront, we're much more chatty, and we're much more forceful. Okay, so while dealing with illusion, we're going to be way more inquisitive than, say, a person from an Asian culture. Ethnocentrism also affects our ability to look at illusions. The attitude that one's culture is superior to others. If we look at illusions from American culture, like Criss Angel and all that, we really like that because that is about us. It's about the person in the crowd. It's focused on the crowd, not the person. While illusions from other cultures focus on different types of focal points. Instead of the audience, it could be on them. Okay? Geography also plays a role in one's perception as well as illusion understanding. Our location in the country, what does it mean to live in different parts? Okay? That affects how we see things. Gender roles play a huge a part of how we see the world. Women are much more likely to be a little more submissive than men, even in Western culture. Men are supposed to be much more dominant and more outgoing. Gender refers to the physiological dimensions of masculine and feminine behavior. Okay? So, influences on perception is culture, gender, social roles. All of these things mix in and affect how we see the world. Whether it's positive or negative, whether we see the illusion or don't. Different things occur for different people. Okay? Another aspect of social roles is relational roles. How does your role affect your own ability? Like, for instance, if I had a stand-up comedian come in the classroom and talk about being a parent and how difficult it is, you'll be able to commiserate a little bit, but you won't understand the parents' side of it. If I had a comedian come in and speak about what life was like in high school and how much they loved or hated high school, you'd be able to relate, so you would enjoy that perception or that viewpoint. Okay? So, also, how we see ourselves is also a major way our perception can be supported or not. We all base ourselves on a self-serving bias. We all see ourselves pretty good. When describing yourself, most people say, I'm pretty good looking, I'm not bad looking. There's definitely people who are way more unattractive. I'm pretty funny. I'm not the funniest, but I'm pretty funny. Okay? What happens is we show the world the positive side. Whether we are actually funny or whether we are actually smart or not, we're always going to say something positive about ourselves. Okay? When we botch a job, for instance, when your friend messes something up, you will say, well, they weren't doing what they were supposed to do and they did it wrong. Okay? When you mess something up, you're not going to say, well, I messed up, I'm an idiot, I couldn't figure it out. You're going to say, well, I didn't really understand the problem, it really wasn't my fault, trying to get the benefit of the doubt. We see ourselves as much more competent than we see our peers. So, common tendencies with perception, just dealing on a more social side, we cling to first impressions. Okay? If some girl was really mean to you when she introduced herself to you, you're always going to think she's a jerk for the rest of your life. Oh, well, she's really not that bad, but she's always kind of a jerk. Okay? Halo effect is what it's called, the tendency to form an overall positive impression of a person based on one positive characteristic. Like, for instance, more attractive people are more likely to be seen as positive. The more attractive you are, the nicer you are, supposedly. The halo effect. So even if you're a terrible person, you've one positive characteristic of being attractive, then you will become. Then the halo effect comes in place, and then there you are. You're a nice person most of the time. We assume that others are similar to us. We believe that everyone has something similar to us, that at the nature of it all, we're all kind of similar. And we're influenced by the obvious. The things we see is what we see. And that inspires us to move forward, move backwards, all that. So let's get into the major philosophies that we'll be dealing with this week. Now, the first major is the Gestalt approach. Okay? Now, the Gestalt psychology is a view that much of perception is based by innate factors built in the brain. So what's going on with this is that we take parts of the brain, all different centers, and we use that to create this larger picture of our perception. Okay? Now, the first thing we need to understand with Gestalt psychology, okay, is that figure, part of the pattern that commands attention. The figure is the one that you first see. We'll be giving you a couple examples as we get going. In Gestalt psychology, the figure is what's in front of your face that you're supposed to see. And the ground is the part of the pattern that does not command attention, the background. Figure and ground are major aspects of Gestalt psychology. Okay? Subjective contours are boundaries that are perceived but do not appear in the stimulus pattern. Okay, so subjective contours are we visualize lines or connections that aren't there. When we have, just like at the visual at the bottom, we have subjective contours, boundaries that are perceived but do not appear in the stimulus pattern. If I asked you what the first shape is, you're all going to tell me, oh, it's a square. Well, it's actually not a square because all of those lines are not connected. You can't have a square that's not connected. But in our mind, when we see that square, rectangle, or circle that's not completed, our brain fills it in and say, oh, well, that's supposed to be filled in, and that's supposed to be a square, that's supposed to be a triangle, and that's supposed to be a circle. That whole policy of filling in those lines is called closure. The tendency to fill in gaps in figures and see incomplete figures as complete. So when we're filling in information that's not there, it's called closure. Okay? So there's major Gestalt laws of perceptual similarity, proximity, continuity, common fate, and pragnaz. We're going to talk about each of these, and I'll give you a visual example. Now, the law of pragnaz is an interesting one. Now, read the triangle below. Now, did you read a bird in the hand? Well, if you did, congratulations. You have fell into my trap. Our brain processes so much information so quickly that most of you aren't even going to notice the error or read the error, even though you may be looking at it now. A bird in the hand is how you should have read it. Who actually read that? Well, we assume in our brain that it's not necessary, so we just skip it. So, law of pragnaz. Okay? So the cocktail party phenomenon is one of the most interesting concepts that we talk about here in psychology because it's actually a pretty important example. Now, when we talk about the cocktail party phenomenon, it's when we're dealing with lots of other people. Okay? So when you go out in a large, crowded room and you're dealing with lots of different people, how can you have a conversation? Technically, all that information, all that conversation would be too much. Well, what it is the ability to focus on one's listening attention on a single talker among a mixture of conversations and background noises, ignoring other conversations. What it means is, with selective attention, we can hone in on different aspects that we are interested in. Have you ever noticed that when you are waiting for a pizza and you're at a party or there's a lot of noises, but as soon as that doorbell rings for the pizza to arrive, everybody hears it, although no one can really have a conversation because the music's too loud? There you go. It's describing the ability to focus one's attention on a single function or focus. It is a form of selective attention, just like we spoke about. So the vestibular sense is one of the senses we will be covering that wasn't technically in sensation. What it is, it tells us where our body is located in space. So where are we in regards to other things? Like, for instance, when we're walking by a table, our vestibular sense is telling us, okay, the table is 3 feet away. You can walk 1 to 2 feet to the left, not 3 feet. It would be too far. Okay? So it's also our sense of balance. Now, from last week, we talked about the vestibular sense, which is homed in the semicircular canals located in our inner ear. Okay? So, looking at this elephant down here, I would say his vestibular sense is very, very good. Okay? It's located in our semicircular canals in our ears. Now, our kinesthetic sense is a little more interesting. It tells us where our body parts are. So the vestibular sense is outside our body. The kinesthetic sense is inside our body, telling us where our body parts are. Okay? Without our kinesthetic sense, you could touch the buttons to make copy of your buttocks. There you go. I thought it was kind of cute. Receptors located in our muscles and joints. Okay, so perception. With selective attention, conscious always a particular stimulus. So selective attention is now when you're looking over here, okay, you're looking at all these boxes, and what are you closing in on? What closure are you seeing? You're probably seeing a 3D cube. Okay, you're giving this picture your selective attention, you're focusing in on it. Or you're also knowing that there's probably a trick since we're in perception. Your closure is filling in all of these boxes so you can see the white strips. Now, perceptual illusions. Now, looking at both A, B, C, between what two rods, A, B, between A or B and C, is the line shorter? I think most of you are going to say A and B. You're going to have to wait for that answer. Okay? Now, this is one of my favorite illusions. This is called the Ames room. Now, looking at this girl, okay, to the right, she is a monster. Look at her. She is huge. Okay? And the other girl is just a little girl. So, with awesome fashion sense on both accounts. Okay? So, let's see a different picture. Holy moly! That little girl is not so little anymore. But the big one is now tiny. How do they do that? Oh my goodness. Oh, I figured it out. This is called the Ames room. It's perceptual organization, the size and distance relationship. In case you haven't noticed, we see things larger the closer they are to us. When things are smaller, things look smaller the further they are away from us. So the higher they are, eye level, the closer they are, the more visually larger they're going to be to us. Okay? You can see looking at this diagram that the girl in the red jacket, she's physically higher up in the room, and she's also closer to the viewer. While the girl in the far corner is much lower to the focal point and is also further away at the diagonal. Okay? So, it's an illusion. Okay? So, another perceptual illusion. Which one has more space between? Well, I think you're going to say probably the black. Well, the black is actually the same. They are both the same. The only thing that's different is that the right has longer lines, which seem to exaggerate the differences. Okay, so how do we perceive things? What's our perceptual organization using Gestalt? The visual capture is the tendency for vision to dominate other senses. Now, if I put you in the Ames room, you're going to see things looking in the little window, and you're going to see there's a huge monster of a girl right in front of you, and there's a little teeny one in the far corner. you're going to see that and you're going to think that's weird, but if you don't know the trick, you're actually going to believe that the girl in front of you is huge and the girl in the far corner is really, really tiny. That whole idea that what we see is truth is visual capture. Now, gestalt is an organized whole. It's a tendency to integrate pieces of information into a meaningful whole. Now that you know that these illusions do exist, when you see them in person, you're going to be able to start saying, wait, okay, I think she's a little higher. There's got to be a trick to this. You start seeing things as a whole rather than parts. Now, when we're using gestalt, we're talking about major differences. But first you have to talk about groupings. The perceptual tendency to organize stimuli into coherent groups. We have to break things down. Now in Gestalt psychology, we break it down into 5 different groupings. Proximity, similarity, continuity, closure, and connectedness. Now proximity is groups nearby figures together. Similarity, group figures that are similar. Continuity, perceive continuous patterns. Closure, fill in the gaps. Connectedness, spots, line, and areas are seen as a unit when connected. I have examples. Okay? So, which one's longer, left or right? Well, they're actually the same thing. This breaks up the continuity. Okay? Figure and ground, as we spoke about before. Which one would be the figure? That would be the dudes walking down the stairs. Or what would be the ground? You could say the arrows. Okay? The thing that calls your attention first are the men walking down the stairs. The ground in this picture would be the arrows. If you didn't see them at first, you're probably going to see them now. Okay? So here's some of those examples. Proximity, things are closer. Are those in the top left corner? Are all those spaced equally? No, they are not. 2 lines are close, there's a larger gap. 2 lines are close, there's a larger gap. 2 lines are close. Similarity. How similar are those objects? Okay, triangles and circles. Similar pattern, not quite similar. Continuity, same shape, going round and round, and connectedness. So there's some visual examples for you. Now, closure, as we spoke of before, even though all we see are bullseyes with a part missing, looking away from it, we see that those gaps are making a triangle. Closure. Okay? Now, grouping principles, a major one is we are dealing with grouping principles at work. Okay? Now, Gestalt is all about looking at the whole. Can this house really exist? Think about it. Look closely at that house. Does it truly exist? We'll get back to that house. Okay? So, depth perception is a huge part of perception. Excuse me. Depth perception is the ability to see objects in 3 dimensions. Okay? Allows us to judge distance. We use this a lot when driving. Binocular cues or retinal disparity. Images from 2 eyes differ. The information from our right eye is being processed in our left brain. The information we see in our right eye is being processed by our left brain. And those two eyes are processing 2 different perspectives on the same thing. Okay, the closer the object, the larger the disparity. So the closer it gets to your face, the more difference, because the eyes can't work together, they're working independently. Now, convergence is something we talked about in class. Okay, it's when the 2 eyes move inward near objects. Okay, remember how you had to look at your finger, okay, and your eyes crossed? That's convergence. Okay, another major one is depth perception. Now, there was a very famous experiment where we were looking to see if children do they actually have depth perception. Of course, we're not ever going to have a baby go off a cliff, because that would be pretty cruel and we could kill some kids. So what we did is we created an experiment where we had a pattern. Obviously, we're going the checkerboards on this one, and we would have a glass plane over the checkerboard, but the checkerboard ends and then glass would continue. Do babies see the difference? Yes, they do actually. With the visual cliff, the babies would not go out most of the time. Okay, so what does that tell us? That our depth perception we are born with. It's an innate response. Now, monocular cues is different from binocular cues. The relative size is a smaller image is more distant. So the closer things are, the more detail we have. The further things are, the less detail we have. The interposition is the closer an object blocks distant objects. That's the problem. Like, for instance, if I'm right in your face, you're not going to see what's going on in the back of the classroom. Relative clarity, hazy objects seen as more distant. So, if all of a sudden, if I take a picture of you and you're standing 10 feet away, but I add a little bit of haze to the picture, people are going to assume you're not 10 feet away, you're 50 feet away. So, the more haze added to a picture, the more distance. Texture, the more coarse it looks, the closer it looks like, the finer the object, the distant it is. Okay? So, monocular cues is up close, binocular is 2 eyes. Okay? So let's look at relative size. Now, looking at this picture, it looks like the people in the very front of the picture are humongous and the people in the back are much smaller. Now, is that really what is happening? These 2 baseball players up front are massive while the other ones are smaller? No, it's interposition. We have one person very up close, which makes everything else shift. Okay, here we go again with another interposition. Now this is a weird one, okay? Definitely a little bit of a depth perception. Is the horse really there? Is the rider really there? Which one is it? Interposition. Okay. Now, when we're dealing with monocular cues, we're also dealing with relative height. Higher objects seem to be more distant. So the taller something is, the further away it is. The relative motion, the closer objects seem to move faster. Linear perspective, you should have heard of this before in art classes and all that stuff. Very famous paintings use linear perspective. You probably had to build a city in like 6th grade where you had to use linear perspective. Its paralines converge with the distance. Relative brightness, closer objects appear brighter. Okay, so we see the very top portion of that line very much further away than it does at the bottom. Okay, here's more perspective. This is linear perspective. You can see how the street gets narrower and narrower the further it goes. Actually, it was Da Vinci who actually really got linear perspective off the ground, and one of the first paintings that uses linear perspective is actually the Mona Lisa. FYI. Okay, light and shadow we use to define depth. Okay, which ones look closer, which ones look further. Okay. Illusionary depth. Now, this looks like it's actual 3D picture, but in a sense, it's not. It's just paper stacked, cut perfectly to make it look like it is a 3D. Okay, perceptual consistency is important. Perceiving objects as unchanging even as illumination and retinal images change. Okay, now look at my doors. What's interesting about my doors? Okay, they're opening, yes. Okay, the color, the shape, and the size is all the same, but what is actually occurring? Well, every time you look at that door, it shifts over a little bit more. So, on the first, when the door is closed, the door's on the left-hand side. On the far right, it's now on the far right-hand side. Did you notice? Probably not. Perceptual organization is also really important. Which one's further, A or B? Well, hopefully by now you're getting the hang of this. Okay, the one that's further back is A. Okay, another illusionary depth explanation. Okay, you can see the paper cut out with all the perfect size, perfect cut, make it look 3D when in fact it's not. Okay, now we talked earlier about that arrow, what was larger, the AB or the BC. They're actually the same length. This is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. What it means is when we have two lines, one facing out, one facing back, we perceive them differently. Okay? Now I showed you a doghouse earlier and asked if there was any trick to it. Hopefully you all said, yes, there's a trick, Miss Reeves. That house cannot exist. Look, the Gestalt principle of being incomplete. You didn't think there were puppies climbing all over that. That would be dangerous. You can see that there's literally holes in the doghouse. It's impossible. You could not build a doghouse to look like that. Okay? So our perceptual adaptation is our vision's ability to adjust to artificially displaced visual field. Okay? So we are constantly being manipulated by things we're seeing in the visual field. Have you ever seen a magician literally move or vanish a house? Or like the White House, they did it to the Washington Monument and all that stuff. Okay, well, did they really make the Washington Monument disappear? Absolutely not. They just changed or displaced the visual field. Perceptual set is the mental predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. What that means is that we are going to watch what the magician wants us to watch. That's our perceptual set. We are going to perceive one thing that we're being told to perceive rather than looking at the hands moving in the background, shifting things, and having people change clothes. That's our perceptual set. So, schemas, okay, looking at the first scene at the very top, you're going to see a saxophone player, okay, just doing some work. But as we see that, then we go down just a little bit more. And is that a saxophone player? It looks kind of strange. Like, is that a bird? Like, what is that? And as we continue to fill in more and more information, we can start seeing that our perceptual set has changed into a woman's face. Okay? So what you see in the center is influenced by your perceptual set. We see the most pronounced thing in the first picture as that saxophone, that nose, the detail. The second one, we start losing it. And then the third one, that focus or that perceptual set has now been erased. Okay? Now, looking at this picture, are those flying saucers or are there clouds? Well, hopefully by now you have a little more sarcasm and a little more disdain that you don't say they're flying saucers, there has to be a trick. And you're probably going to say they're clouds because it couldn't be that easy. Now, are there extrasensory perceptions? You know, there's a very popular TV show on, you know, talking to the dead is always a very common thing. Every couple years there's a new medium coming out. What we're talking about when you can talk to the dead and sense the dead and all that is an extrasensory perception. It's a controversial claim that perception can occur apart from sensory input. So what is essentially going on, we have a medium, is that they're receiving information when there is no information to be received verbally, auditory, visual, all that stuff. We have many names for this: telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, okay? That we receive information not knowing where it's coming from or not coming from a normal, idealized location. Parapsychology is the study of paranormal phenomenon, ESP, psychokinesis, also known as Ghostbusters. Just kidding. They're the ones going out to see if this is actually does it actually work? Does it actually occur? Do they actually learn anything? Do they have any extra senses and perceptions? Every time it's proven no. Like the Long Island medium or whatever her name is on TLC. there was a very scientific study they wanted to do on her and see if she was actually doing it, and she politely has declined for like 10 years now. So there's probably a reason. What we have learned and what we have seen is that there is no, without any sensory input, there can be no perception. So is it skilled guessing? Is it, insider knowledge? Who knows? But it's what you think. Scientifically, we cannot prove it actually does occur. But if it makes you feel better thinking, you can communicate with the dead, then please, whatever makes you happy. All right, well, we went through this really quick. We have a very busy week this week with short periods as well as a short week. I hope you all find this helpful. We did fly through this very quick, and I hope you have a great night, and I'll see you in class. Thanks, guys. Bye.